So the hot topic of Australian rugby, yes, I'm going to take on that subject in this video. So if you're interested to learn a little bit more about what I think around what's wrong with Australian rugby right now, then continue watching this video. G'day and welcome to Inside Rugby. If you haven't been here before, well, my name is Mark. I'm a Kiwi rugby fan that's living in beautiful Cancun in Mexico, and I thought it was time to put a video together around my thoughts on the Wallabies. Yes, they haven't had a very good World Cup, have they? And a lot of people are having their say on what they think Australian rugby should do from here on in. So I'm going to put together some of my thoughts in this video, and also ask you to drop your thoughts around what you think Australian rugby should do going forward. So let's get into the subject. It's a pretty complex one and there's lots of different moving parts, so I'll tell you what my opinion is. Now, while I am a Kiwi, I have lived in Australia previously in my life journey for about 20 years, so I know the country very well and I know the rugby community there pretty well as well. So I'm not coming entirely from a point of naivety. And I must say I've been fairly disappointed in a number of ex-Australian players in the last couple of days since Australia lost to Wales. And I'm in particularly disappointed in somebody called Drew Mitchell, who used to play for Australia a number of years ago. And Drew Mitchell came out on a number of videos and talked about his disgust using the F-bomb in a number of different ways to talk about the opposition that Australia played, particularly Fiji and Wales, and saying in no uncertain terms that Australia should not lose to these effing teams. Well, Drew, let me tell you something. This is part of the problem, is the Australian culture and how you guys actually communicate and portray yourself around the world of rugby. And your comments didn't do any favours, I don't think, to Australian rugby across the world. And let me tell you why. Because first of all, as an ex-Wallaby rugby player, you should be a role model, mate, and you should be showing the young players how to take defeat by better teams. And both Fiji and Wales, they deserved to beat Australia in both of those games. And it's nothing about Australia having an entitlement to beat those particular countries anymore. If they're better prepared and they play better on the day, then they are deserved winners, and that's exactly what happened in those two games. So very disappointing from Drew Mitchell to come out with those kinds of comments. But this video of mine is not about attacking any one individual. I want to talk about the systematic problems in Australian rugby and sharing some statistics and facts that a lot of people watching this video may not know. Now, I'm a Kiwi, so some people might think I have a little bit of bias in this. I don't, because I don't think New Zealand rugby's in a very good position at the moment, and we're going to find that out around about quarter-final times in this Rugby World Cup. So it could be the first situation where we have both a New Zealand and Australian rugby teams back home before the semi-finals of a World Rugby Cup. That would be quite a unique situation. But let's focus on Australia right now in this video, and I just want to use some statistics to share some of the information today. And first of all, I'm going to start off with how many rugby clubs there are in Australia, and there's 767 rugby clubs in Australia at the moment, and there's only 600 in New Zealand. That compares to the Northern Hemisphere, where in England there's something like 1,800 rugby clubs. Now, as far as the number of players playing the game in Australia, have over 170,000 registered players playing rugby in the country today, and in New Zealand 150,000, so 20,000 less in New Zealand. But then if you take a look at England again, they've got 1,800 clubs and they've got 2.2 million registered rugby players in the UK. So a very deep selection pool and pool of talent to be able to choose for the national team. Now, in Australia, I think a lot of people have been talking about, well, there's too many teams in Super Rugby from Australia. They need to reduce the number of teams. That's going to help the competition. But I don't actually think that's the problem at all. If you look in New Zealand, New Zealand has 5 teams in the current Super Rugby campaign, and we have less players to choose from. So places are a priority, and to make sure that there's healthy competition for those places. And that's what Australia needs to develop in their system. They've got to create pathways, I believe, for these young players not only to come up through academies, but also to stay within the Australian rugby system and not to get poached by AFL or Rugby League, the two competing codes in Australia, which is very, very difficult because they have the money to go with it. So first of all, I want to suggest that the Australian Rugby Union needs to look at the pathways for younger players to keep them in the game, keep them motivated, but also to keep them supported. And that's the very essence of all this. A lot of these Australian players need more tough games in that Super Rugby competition, and that's part of the problem because the competition doesn't appear to be strong enough on the Australian side of the Tasman Sea. And if you look at the young team that's gone to this year's Rugby World Cup, there's a lot of inexperience in that team. And one has to question again, why weren't some of the more senior members of that Australian team taken to France to help, to guide and to bleed these younger players into the stages of the Rugby World Cup? Because we saw that against Wales. It was like a ship without a rudder. And I think one of the big problems that no one's really been talking about is Will Skelton wasn't on the field against Wales because he's injured at the moment. And I think Eddie Jones has been trying to position Will Skelton as the next long-term captain of Australia, and that's something that they really desperately need, is leadership, I think, because if you look at how many captains they've had so far this year, I think it's 6 captains, and it hasn't worked out for the team as far as having consistent leadership in that team. So that's something else that they really need. But if you look back at that Super Rugby competition, I don't think there needs to be a reduction in the number of Super Rugby teams in Australia. I think the quality of rugby needs to improve. The systems of bringing these players need to improve so that, like their counterparts in New Zealand, where there's 5 Super Rugby teams in New Zealand, that the level of play is better. And that comes down to coaching and the support of coaches within the Australian system. And I think that's something the Australian Rugby Union needs to do a better job at the moment. Now, of course, there's been a lot of finger pointing at Eddie Jones because of Australia's performance at this year's Rugby World Cup, and even before that, throughout the Rugby Championship and since Eddie took over his tenure. Now, I've put together a couple of slides here to look at what's happened with Australian rugby over the last 12 months. And it's very interesting to see when Dave Rennie was in charge. And of course, if you don't know, Dave Rennie is a New Zealander, coached the Wallabies in 2022. And it was looking like Australia was going to build with Dave Rennie up into and through the Rugby World Cup. But he was fired, and Eddie Jones was brought in by Hamish McLellan to take over the job at the Australian Wallabies as the Australian Wallabies head coach. Now, if you look at how Dave Rennie was actually performing as the head coach of the Australian Wallabies, and last year he had some pretty good results. In fact, last year Dave Rennie's team bet Wales 39 points to 34. They got within 3 points of Ireland, which was better than what South Africa did in the weekend. They lost by a point to Italy, and they lost by 1 point to France. And some would say those are very good results indeed for Australia. And why would Dave Rennie get the sack on the back of those results heading into a World Cup year? So Eddie Jones came in. I don't have a negative opinion of Eddie Jones as a coach. I think all coaches have their expiry date, and it goes on flows and ebbs and flows. And I think Eddie Jones, if you look at his resume over the entire time that he's been a rugby coach, he's done better than most rugby coaches around the world. So you can't say the guy's a bad rugby coach. Maybe you can say the way he goes about his job, he upsets a lot of people, a lot of staff have left, and obviously upsets a lot of players. And there has been a tendency throughout his career to see teams that he's coached fall off after a couple of years of his tenure. But when he took over the Wallabies, the first thing he wanted to do was to bring some young guys into the team. He was going to use the Rugby Championship as a platform for doing that. And their first game under his tutelage was in South Africa, throwing the Lions in the Lions Den more or less, taking on the Springboks, and Australia was duly thrashed in that game by 43 points to 12. And then the Wallabies went home and they played Argentina next in Australia, and everybody thought that that was going to be an opportunity for Eddie Jones and the boys to get things turned around after that significant South Africa loss. And up to the last minute of that particular game, the Wallabies were in the lead thanks to an intercept tried by Mark Nawaqanita Wasi, and Argentina came back and stole that game from Australia in the last minute. And that, I think, had a really big psychological impact on this young Australian team. 34 points to 31 it was to Argentina in the end. And I think if Australia had won that game, they would have gone through the rest of that rugby championship a little bit more positive than what we saw. So I think that Argentina game in Australia was a really big turning point for this team. And then they had to back up against the All Blacks, and that was always going to be a difficult task after going down closely to Argentina. And the All Blacks end up thumping Australia 38 points to 7 in their next game. So that was 3 games in a row that Eddie had lost, and I think the panic started to set in then, because the return match against the All Blacks, they had to throw everything at it. And credit to Australia, they really turned up in that game in Dunedin, and it was a very close score. The All Blacks, I thought, lucky to get away with that one, 23-20. So there were signs in that game, and a lot of people were writing about it in the press. The people that are writing off the Wallabies now and Eddie Jones now, they were writing in the press that this was looking really good. They took the All Blacks to the brink, and it was only a matter of time before the Wallabies were going to get a win on the board, and this young team was going to be able to show what they've got. So the Wallabies went to France ahead of the Rugby World Cup, and their last warm-up game was against France at the Stade de France. And I thought that was a really good idea, just to see where the Wallabies were at in their warm-up stages to this Rugby World Cup. They got soundly beaten, 41 points to 17 in that game, but there were glimpses again in the first half that Australia can hang with the best rugby teams in the world. And I still had belief at that stage that they were going to be able to turn things around. So Australia drew Georgia in their first game in the Rugby World Cup in this Pool C, and they bet Georgia 35 points to 15. So a lot of people were saying, well, it started to look like a good Australian team, but their tests would come against both Fiji, who had beaten England, of course, and had gone very close to Wales, to beating Wales, and then it was going to be on to Wales for Australia. So 2 tough games in Fiji and Wales coming up. Now, they lost that game to Fiji, and they lost it quite considerably, I think. I think Fiji were definitely the dominant team on the day. And then we started to hear from the Australian press and a lot of their ex-players about, oh no, this is not looking good, and that the sudden death game against Wales was looming very large in the near future. And so we saw last weekend, Wales too good for Australia across the whole field, and I would say also off the field when it comes to their coaching staff and the way they managed their game. So how does a team go from nearly beating France, losing to France by 1 point just 10 months ago, and losing by just 3 points to the #1 ranked team in the world? How do they go from that to the situation they find themselves in today? Well, Eddie Jones has to take some of the responsibility for that, if not a lot of the responsibility. And I think what's happened in recent times is that Eddie Jones has lost the respect of the dressing room of the Australian Wallaby players. Got to understand that a lot of these young people in this Wallabies team are out there on their first Rugby World Cup. It's all new to them. There's a lot of pressure on them, and we saw that pressure building on this team before they left Australia. Eddie Jones was trying to take a lot of deflection away from the team, but let's face it, in today's world with the open communication through social media, a lot of the undercurrent would have been very visible to a lot of these players in this Australian team. It would have been almost impossible for them to step away from all the white noise that was going on around Eddie Jones. The other factor that I think's become very obvious to me is when I listen to these press conferences from Eddie Jones after these games, for the last 8 games, he's been saying that we need to work on very similar aspects of the Wallabies game. And then they turn up in the next game and they create the same mistakes again. So there doesn't seem to be any learning or evolution going on within this team. And if you watch some of the other top teams in the Rugby World Cup, they will learn from their previous game, come back with a different strategy or a different selection process, and they will try to take it on. Now, I'm really awash with some of the players in the Australian team because they've got world-class players there. Marika Koriembete, we were just talking a few months ago about how he's one of the best wingers in the world, yet on the game day against Wales this weekend, he touched the ball 3 times. So if you've got a world-class winger, aren't you building some of your game plan around getting him involved in the game? But that wasn't happening from Australia. And granted, they've got a rookie number 9, they've got a rookie number 10, 2 10s who are rookies, and they're just not able to put that game plan together. But I think this is something that comes from the head coach, or should be coming from the head coach. So there's not a clear plan in place to be able to involve these players who have got this expertise and knowledge and experience. Someone like Koroibete, someone like Karevi, who is a fantastic rugby player, but we haven't seen anywhere near the best of them in this Rugby World Cup, and also leading up to the Rugby World Cup as well. And then you've got the conversation that's just not going to go away for Eddie Jones, and that's the one behind leaving Quade Cooper and Michael Hooper behind in Australia. And I felt really sorry for Michael Hooper in the weekend, and it just showed how much of a fantastic human being he is, and also a leader when he stood in there in front of the TV cameras in that studio in Australia after the game against Wales, and he took responsibility as well for that loss, saying, I'm part of that team, I was part of that unit, I was part of that squad before he got dropped. And you could see the pain that he was going through, and that sums up a person like Michael Hooper. And I guess it goes back a little bit to the type of character I was talking about with Drew Mitchell earlier in this video, and that's the big difference between these two human beings. And I think Michael Hooper really showed the passion that he has for the game, and one of the very reasons why he should have been the first person on that plane for this Wallaby team to go off to France for this Rugby World Cup. His presence on the field, his presence off the field to help these younger players to deal with adversity as and when it happens would have been a huge thing. Now, I'm not going to say that the outcome of these games against Fiji and Wales may have been different just because Michael Hooper was there, but I will say that I don't think the Wallabies would have looked as shell-shocked as they were against Fiji and against Wales because of Michael Hooper's experience and being a leader who leads by example on and off the field. Now, I know hindsight's a wonderful thing, and a lot of people are going to say, yeah, well, that's all very good, and it may not have been any different with Quade Cooper and Michael Hooper there. I probably would agree on some of that. But I think in terms of the systematic problems that exist today within the Australian Rugby Union need to be fixed first. So as you can probably appreciate from the things that I'm talking about in this video, there's a whole complexity around why Australian rugby is putting out performances like they did against Wales on the weekend. First of all, you came up against a better opponent. That has to be respected and acknowledged. The second thing is, obviously they're not doing it the right way. Now, I heard a story, I don't know if it's true, that there's 15 coaches involved in the Australian setup at this Rugby World Cup. Multi-million dollars worth of an investment had gone in, and yet 3 times during that game against Wales they weren't able to catch a high ball. So you're putting all that money into a team, you're putting all those coaching and all that efforts into it, yet you've got players that are not doing the basics in the game of rugby. Questions need to be asked around that, I think. And finally, I want to say that some of it is cultural. If I look at New Zealand and Australia, where obviously I've spent a large part of my life, and when it comes to rugby, there's a lot of arrogance within the system, and that causes problems. And I think we're starting to see that now in this Rugby World Cup. There's been an entitlement culture for quite a long time between the All Blacks and the Australian Rugby Union, thinking that we're always going to end up at the last end of these significant tournaments around the world. The fact the New Zealanders have beaten the Australians in the Bledisloe Cup for so long gives them a sense of entitlement to that particular trophy, but it also shows what happens when New Zealand and Australia go up against the really good Northern Hemisphere teams and the Southern Hemisphere teams in South Africa. We always have problems, and it's become very apparent in this year's Rugby World Cup, particularly with New Zealand, around the pressure situation that they find themselves in. And I'm going to be making another video about this as we go forward in this year's Rugby World Cup. So I think there's a cultural issue there as well. There's a lot of arrogancy within that Australian rugby unit, and whether you like it or not, when a lot of these ex-players end up still in the system somewhere, a lot of this arrogancy trickles down into those people that they're having a direct impact on. So I think there needs to be some very honest, open, transparent communications going on within the Australian rugby community right now. There's a lot of hand-on-heart situations that need to be said, not people writing press releases and putting things out there about the coach that are potentially not true. But I think what they need to really do in Australian rugby is settle down on understanding where they want to go and how they're going to get there. And I think a lot of fat needs to be trimmed off the carcass as well. I think there's too many hangers on that are hanging on to this Australian rugby team for all sorts of different reasons, and that's got to start at the top. They always say the fish stinks from the head, and questions need to be asked whether or not the Australian Rugby Union board is the right board to take this team forward towards the next World Cup. And of course the next Rugby World Cup is going to be in Australia, and it's going to be their opportunity to once again shine in the world of rugby. 4 years goes past very, very fast, so a lot of work has to be done by all the stakeholders involved, and they all need to come together united. Now is not a time for division within Australian rugby. There needs to be some decisive decisions made around the pathways for players coming in and staying within the rugby system within Australia, how Australia competes on the domestic and international stage, and also how the coaches' systems are developed and supported through that process. You can't be changing your coach every few months when the results don't go the way they're planned. There needs to be stability and sustainability put into this Australian rugby system. And like any healthy business, the people that are recruited for these jobs need to go through a fair and equitable process. And I would argue the fact that over the years there's been a lot of questionable appointments made within the Australian Rugby Union of mates for mates and mates who know mates who have got into the system. Those days have to be gone, and it has to be changed right now for Australian rugby to prosper going into the future. So there you go, there's some of my thoughts around why the Australian rugby unit is the way that it is today. I think there's a collective reason, a number of reasons around it. Not everything sits on Eddie Jones. He's responsible for how the players are playing, the teams that are selected, the game plan that's put together for those teams, and the communication that goes around that. And there's been a big failing in that process at this year's Rugby World Cup. The bigger picture goes out to the way that players are supported through the pathways in Australian rugby, and how they get guided as they get up into that super rugby environment. That's very, very important. We've got players that have turned up to this year's Rugby World Cup playing for Australia that have played very little rugby at this level of rugby, and it really, really shows. Now, of course, I think it's a crying shame that Australian rugby's got to this stage, but sometimes you have to hit rock bottom in life to be able to rebuild, and I think this is the time now for Australian rugby to do that. I just hope and I pray that not all the red tape and the politics come out now and everybody starts blaming everybody else, and a couple of years have gone by before any significant changes are made, because the change needs to be made now. So there you go, there are my thoughts around Australian rugby. As you can probably tell, I'm a passionate rugby fan. I want to see Australian rugby doing well on the global stage. They deserve it with all the emphasis they put into the game, but it needs to be emphasis that's put in the right direction in the right areas. And this Rugby World Cup has really shown the weak links in the chain for the Australian system. So let me know in the comments what you think about the current rugby situation in Australia. If you're a Wallabies fan and you've got some insight into this in Australia, I'd love to hear from you. Everybody, I'm sure, has got an opinion to share on how the Australian Rugby Union can turn this around. So I look forward to reading those comments as and when they come in. Now stick with me here on Inside Rugby. We've got a fantastic Rugby World Cup going forward at the moment. Some great games coming up this week and this weekend. Looking forward to those and to seeing who's going to surprise us again this weekend in the Rugby World Cup. Until next time, stay well, stay safe everybody, and I'll see you again soon in the next video. Until then, bye for now.